I will introduce you all to this special lecture, the first time in a few years that our director has taken to the podium on her own to give us some wisdom and insight as we approach the 158th birthday of W.E.B. Du Bois on Monday. It's a busy time of year at the Du Bois Center. We have events here, we have events in Great Barrington. There are all kinds of things happening on campus and beyond, which speaks to the continued relevance of Du Bois and his power to help us think through the issues of our own time. But it's my job today to introduce the lady who's just run away, our brilliant director, Professor Whitney Battle-Baptiste, who's professor of anthropology here at UMass, and also former president of the American Anthropological Association. She is the beating heart of the Du Bois Center, both intellectually, spiritually, morally, and philosophically. And none of our work would be possible without her. So please join me in welcoming Whitney.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for coming, and good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yes. So this is my third talk this week about Du Bois. I have to say that I'm very popular during the 28 and sometimes 29 days of February, which is also known as Black History Month. It shouldn't be like that, right? I should be busy 365 days because Black history happens every day. But that being said, when I decided to do this conversation, and call it conversation as opposed to lecture, because I would like to, hear back from you a little bit, towards the end, not just question and answer, but maybe some responding, because I want to talk about what's happening today in the United States of America. And not to say, what would Du Bois think? Because there's no way that we could get at what Du Bois would have thought, because he passed away, or he transitioned on the eve or just the night before the March on Washington, which happened a little while ago. So there's a lot that has happened. And as I guess elders have said to me throughout my youth and then further on, the more things change, the more they stay the same, which is something I was like, that doesn't make sense. And now I'm older and it makes sense. There's nothing new under the sun. No, you didn't invent that. We've done it before. It just is in a different package. This moment is something that what I'd like to do is look at certain kind of key moments in Du Bois's time, and then kind of bring a present event or issue and just not compare and contrast, but do more along the lines of Du Bois's work continuing. And as I go on, you'll understand what I'm saying in terms of past events, etc. I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about the criminal justice system in the United States. I want to start here because, in part, if we think about the increase in prisons, the continued demographic imbalance in our prison system right now. And I'm just last week, we having a collaborative conversation with Tom Reedy, the current director of the Scottsboro Boys Museum in Scottsboro, Alabama. And the Scottsboro Boys case happened in 1931. 9 young men And the reason why it was kind of termed Scottsboro Boys was to bring up the fact that these boys ranged from the age of 13 and the oldest being 20, but it was to push and reiterate the narrative of seeing them not as grown men, but as boys, one of which apparently, when was read the charges, did not even know the definition of the word rape. However, these 9 young men were accused of raping 2 white women, on a train. And we've learned, I want to say Google it, but yeah, Google it actually, if you don't know about it, because I think that it's a statement that more of us don't learn about the Scottsboro Boys case, because it was such an important moment. In the Constitution, we have the right to a jury of our peers. Yet in the state of Alabama, in that moment, Black Americans could not serve on juries. So if the defendant is Black and Black folk can't serve on juries, that creates a problem of having a jury of your peers. In this sense, I talked about, and we had a great event in Great Barrington, a conversation with myself and Dr. Reedy about this very thing. We uphold and we talk about the importance of the Constitution. And at the same time, we need to look at the fine print and understand, how does that Constitution protect all of us? Ergo, does it protect all of us? And in 1931, it was clear that it did not protect 9 young men who were on trial in Alabama. After that, Dr. Reedy encouraged me to watch it's a documentary called The Alabama Solution. And it is, I had to pause at a couple of moments because it was very intense. This was filmed between 2016 and about 2024, 2025. So it was a long period of time. And I'm not going to give away why the film is called The Alabama Solution, but it resonates with very similar kinds of sentiment that you hear in 1931 about, we don't want to take instruction or commit, or we don't want folks from outside Alabama telling us what to do. There's a way that we deal with stuff here in Alabama. And I just gave it away. That's the Alabama solution. There is an Alabama solution. And that was a quote from the governor, of the then governor of Alabama. So I'm saying that because, and what it was incarcerated men with cell phones, contraband cell phones. And the images that they captured on these cell phones, I know why they're contraband. You don't want the conditions to be filmed. You don't want the violence to be captured. You don't want to look at the ways in which correctional officers are exercising and using violence as an everyday practice. And the reasoning behind the cell phones is simply because, as a criminal, no one believes you. As a criminal, no one thinks you deserve, not rights, because that would be wrong, right? But when you're in the prison industrial complex, right, there are things that are taken away from you as an American citizen or as a US citizen. And so I'm bringing these two, actually I skipped a very important one for me, and then I'm going to get back to why I'm bringing this up first in relation to Du Bois. The one I skipped over was, for me, I guess, first of all, Emmett Till, his murder in 1955, and Mamie Till, his mother's decision to have an open casket, to have his body visible and put on a major magazine. Why is that? Why would she do that? How could she do that? You're talking about the transition of the United States from a radio kind of situation to television, where you could see things, visual. So this is the beginnings of the violence against folks who were protesting, being hit by water, being chased by dogs, etc. And it was now in your living room. It was unavoidable. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, the crossing of it, and Bloody Sunday, which is coming up next month, also in Alabama. And these were images that you could not make up. This was what was happening on a daily basis. So from, I would say, Emmett Till, Scottsboro Boys, actually, and Scottsboro Boys used media as well. It used media in the sense that the Communist Party, and I did say initially, I thought it was Communist Party USA, but no, Communist Party, like Moscow, was part of the initial jumping to defend as the lawyers of the Scottsboro Nine, right? And when I say that, it is, well, why, where was the NAACP? The NAACP realized that the communist connection was a little problematic. There was a lot of problematic things with the Communist Party at that moment in 1931. Yet it wasn't completely foreign for the Communist Party to do things that, and Socialist Party to do things that supported Black Americans. This crazy thing like the equal distribution of wealth, or the idea that people who had labored and built this country to actually benefit from what they put in. Those kinds of sentiments in many ways resonated more with communism than they did with capitalism. However, the Communist Party defending the Scottsboro Boys, and they got an amazing lawyer, a Jewish American from New York, and he went down to Alabama and did his thing. However, it wasn't really palatable to the Alabama public. So is a witness on the stand, and he is going at her, like cross-examination, going at her, and she's a white woman, and she's not protected in that space of the jury box, or of the witness, testifying. And what that does is it really hurts the case in general, because the Southern way is not to attack a white woman. That's why they're in this court at that day, right? And so it didn't work out. But the NAACP was the means of which getting the word out and making the Scottsboro case internationally known. So literally, newspapers, it started out perhaps with Black newspapers, distribution, but then it became an international issue. It brought a light that wasn't necessarily a common thing for such a small case in a small town in the South. And so that was like the media, what we would say media today, newspapers, that was it expanding it out. Du Bois was a part of that, getting the word out, not necessarily lending the lawyers, as the NAACP would do much more often with Brown v. Board of Education and other very, very influential court cases. However, the idea of the media was then expanded when Emmett Till's murder happened, and that also went out publicly. And that image was so visceral and it was so real because Mamie Till wanted everyone to see what they did to her son. This is what racism looks like. This is what lynching in this moment in 1955 looks like. Now, the anti-lynching bill that has been year after year proposed in the US Congress, it passed in 2024, 2025. So Emmett Till was 1955, and it just passed. That's a very long time. And they never gave up. Folks never gave up on that anti-lynching bill. Hopefully we can keep it. We'll just leave that right there. Fast forward for me, the one that I wanted to talk about is, as a New Yorker, as a high school student in the late 80s, and yes, I look good for my age, thank you. I was around when the exonerated five were arrested, and they were then called the Central Park Five, the rapists. The current person living in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue took out full-page ads calling for New York State to bring back the death penalty, to kill these five boys, who were boys. So for me, I had heard about Scottsboro Boys because my mother, who's right here, is a historian, and it was also often when I would learn in school wasn't where learning would end. We'd learn more details. But when the the exonerated five actually happened, I began to be curious about the Scottsboro Boys, because it was like something, this has happened before. And I'm looking at the ways in which it's not about innocent until proven guilty. The media had made these five young men guilty, coining terms like wilding and the kinds of things that Black boys do in New York City. And it was kind of as a New Yorker, you would know, like, who's running in Central Park at night? It's scary for New Yorkers. However, it's not about blaming the victim in that sense. It was about what were these boys doing? They were five among many who were out there that night. They're the ones that were caught. They're the ones, and then for them to be exonerated after the true perpetrator of this crime came out and said that he had done it and he knew he'd done it. So they spent full time in jail before he actually came out and said that he had done this crime. It was just marking these moments, to me, is why it's important for us to understand the past and then understand that if we don't deal with past that makes everyone uncomfortable, then we will repeat it over and over again. And so I think about Du Bois, and I think about the ways in which he was looking at a situation such as the prison industrial complex, or, well, then it wasn't prison industrial complex, but for him to look at the striving of Black folks. The fact that in 1900, there was created a Paris Exposition, or the American Negro exhibit, that is displayed at the World's Exhibition in Paris. And this exhibition holds literature, art, data, all of these things about the progress of Black Americans since 1865 to 1900. That was the focus of this exhibit. Now, right alongside, not right next to, but in the same fair, you have human zoos. You have looking at human hierarchies of superiority and inferiority happening in the same spaces as the American Negro exhibit is happening. And this is where his infographics come into play. I say his, but I want to back that up because Du Bois was not the only person that pulled that data together, made these amazing images. It was students from Atlanta University, historically Black college, now called Clark Atlanta University, but Atlanta University and his colleagues. Du Bois was doing sociological methods in 1890s, because he came out with the Philadelphia Negro. The first time where an urban area, understanding the lives and experiences of Black people. Within that, he talks about criminality. The criminality, not in that Black people are more prone to do crime. They are more prone to be viewed as criminal just in their corporal being, in their body. So Du Bois is looking at why is it that this one particular area in Philadelphia becomes the space where progress in many ways is limited, right? The criminality of things is very much par for the course. It is happening on a regular basis without people calling it out very specifically for anything. So am I thinking about the ways in which Du Bois is calling out our society and the inequity in the ways in which people experience the judicial system? How Black men are often seen as the offenders of a crime before the judge, the jury, or anyone makes a decision about the case. And so criminality, the body, Blackness, race, all of these things are connected. And the thread that is connecting them, unfortunately, it continues. And it's 2026. And it might shift a little bit because we have some new folks on the block, ICE, and state-sanctioned violence, right? In 2020, we had a pandemic, but we also had the murder of George Floyd. And there was this moment, right, where we all were like, it comes out, and that moment went away. Monies were put here and put there. Historically, Black colleges got a lot of donations. Actually, federal, sure that's over. But that reactionary thing doesn't mean that the systemic roots of what's happening ever changes. It's because we have social media, we have TikTok, we have Instagram, so you can protest and show people you're out there in the streets, and then you can go about your day or go about your life. And it could happen again, we don't know, but that criminality, that media, that giving the idea of what's happening is not new. It's been happening, especially when it comes to race relations. And Du Bois, I would say, was central in that, especially as editor of The Crisis magazine that was distributed to Black households across the United States, a little bit beyond, but especially in the United States. Because each city had a Black newspaper, well, not many cities had Black newspapers. However, imagine something that you could pull together news from all over, even internationally, and distribute that so that folks are learning about the same events that are happening. People are learning about the kinds of, folks in Chicago are learning about what's happening in the South, because many of them are from the South. And so you're looking at the distribution of information in a way that we think is regular. And for The Crisis magazine, it was a real innovative thing of the moment. And Du Bois was at that cutting edge. And I don't think, in many ways, we think of him like that in terms of his ability and to use propaganda for good and not evil. But when I say propaganda, I'm talking specifically because Du Bois talked about his use of propaganda. Statements loosely quoting him that all art is propaganda, and if it is not, what is it doing? You know, artists, and for me, as a member of the hip hop generation, I also think about, you know, the ways in which hip hop is against the grain. It was a way in which young people who had no voice created a voice from the Bronx and hip hop is from the Bronx, so yay. I'm gonna read a little teeny bit. I'm not gonna read Du Bois because I feel like I always read Du Bois, and I feel not that that's cliche, but when you talk about Du Bois, we often read, the souls of Black folk. It's good, but what I want to do is take a contemporary scholar and look at how many contemporary scholars are influenced by the work, the words, the ways in which Du Bois created pathways to disseminate information, and so that no one felt isolated in the US and eventually outside of the US, the Caribbean, and the continent of Africa. So this is Joy James, who was our lecturer here for our annual lecture 2 years ago? 2 years ago. So Joy James and Joao Costa Vargas, who's at UC Riverside. He's my friend, but he went to California. He's the East Coast. Like, why would you go there? Anyway. So both of them ask in an amazing collection of essays titled Refusing Blackness versus Victimization, Trayvon Martin and the Black Cyborgs. I'm serious, it's a very deep read. What happens when instead of becoming enraged and shocked every time a Black person is killed in the United States, we recognize Black death as a predictable and constitutive aspect of this democracy? What will happen then if instead of demanding justice, we recognize, or at least consider, that the very notion of justice produces and requires Black exclusion and death as normative? The ongoing state-sanctioned legal and extra-legal murders of Black people are normative, and for this so-called democracy, necessary. It is the ground we walk on, and that it is the ground lays out that and perhaps how we might begin to live in relation to this requirement for our death. What kinds of possibilities for rupture might be opened up? What happens when we proceed as if we know this, anti-Blackness to be the ground on which we stand, the ground from which we too attempt to speak, for instance, an I or a we, who know that I or we, who cares? Who cares that Black death is acceptable? It's normalized. This particular book, and this particular book is Christina Sharp's In the Wake of Blackness and Being, and I think it's very important because I think that what we don't put together as scholars, sometimes we get very caught in the mud of the archive, of the scholarship, of the writing, of the lecturing, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens is that sometimes some of us, when we teach, we're able to get pulled out of that mud to actually interact with students and think about the ways in which students' experiences of a different generation. I learn a lot from students when I interact with them, because I wonder how they look at things that I get just very angry and upset about. But how does that shift? How do young people think about it? Or, like my children say, Mom, everything is not about race. Yes, it is. And I'm their mother, so I hope like when they're older, like they're teens right now, I'm hoping when they're older, they go, my mom was smart. She was right. And for me, Christina Sharp's work really helped me to understand that this dance of the past and present. And she talks about, she articulates through her work a method of encountering a past that is not past, a method along the lines of a sitting with, a gathering, and a tracking of phenomena that disproportionately and devastatingly affect Black peoples any and everywhere we are. I've been thinking of this gathering, this collecting, and reading toward a new analytic as the wake and wake work. And I am interested in plotting, mapping, and collecting the archives of the everyday Black imminent and imminent death, and in tracking the ways we resist, rupture, and disrupt the imminence and imminence aesthetically and materially. I am interested in how we imagine ways of knowing the past in excess of the fictions of the archive. But not only that, I am interested too in the ways we recognize the many manifestations of that fiction and that access, that past, not yet past, in the present. So it's a lot of play on words, but what I really want you to get out of that, and I'm gonna tell you right now, Christina Sharp she's an amazing woman. And when I met her in Toronto, because I don't think she would ever teach in the United States, actually, or that's what she told me. She was like, she knew my work, and that just blew my mind, because I was like, I've been reading your book like I'm a fangirl. What do you mean you're a fangirl of me? That was weird. But it was very humbling, and it made me realize that that idea of a past that is not past is not something new to coin, but she also talks about the mapping. And in Black geographies, and so by Kittrick's work on Black geographies, there is also the book about the violence of archives. Marissa, I'm thinking first names here, that's the problem. Thank you. When you buy your friends' books, you forget their names. But thinking about all the ways in which geographies, the archival, how we look at archives. And I'm not talking about only colonial archives or the archives of the British Museum or the Library of Congress or folks like that, but I'm talking about the ways in which archives of us, our archives, which are very dominant in this building, if you don't know, and if you know online. But if you think about, we hold the Irma McLaurin Black Feminist Archive. And in that archive, we have real physical and not just papers, but ephemera. Like, I'm an archaeologist by training. So for me, if it's a material, if it's artifact, I'm very, very excited. And although I don't dig in dirt anymore, because I'm older and my back hurts, but digging in the archives is just as rewarding, maybe too rewarding sometimes, because there is no reality show that could beat an archive. Let's say that again. There is no reality show that could beat an archive. At least it's not scripted. You understand? It's real people exchanging back and forth. And I'm very excited because I said I gave 2 talks this week, actually on the same day, online. One was with the Connecticut Data Collaborative, which are amazing, using data for equity and democracy. Like, it just blew my mind. And we were talking about the infographics and Du Bois's data portraits in that talk. But then in that evening, I had a talk with a group of women from Baltimore, from the Du Bois Circle, which was started in 1902. And I said to them, I was very embarrassed as a Du Bois scholar. And I want to say that I had never heard of the Du Bois Circle. They started in 1902. And why have I not, why are you all not a part of this narrative? The good thing, Dean of Libraries, is that I think they really, I know they really, really want their papers to be here. I think they have like all of the minutes from every meeting since 1902, sans a couple, here and there. And it's a very limited number. I want to say it's something like under 30 or maybe at the 30. And I'm like, and I asked them, what is the reason for this number? And the outgoing president said, it's because that's how many people fit in Mrs. So-and-so's parlor. That's what determined the numbers. And then we maintain that tradition. I was like, oh. But Nina Gomer, Du Bois's first wife, whom after the death of Burkhard Du Bois in Atlanta, moved to Baltimore. And that's basically where she made her home for many years, where she, and I say she specifically, she raised their daughter, their second child, and also their granddaughter, Du Bois Williams. And so Baltimore and Yolande and Nina Gomer would sometimes go to the meetings, but that Du Bois Circle was actually created in many ways as a response to the Niagara movement not allowing women initially. And then there's a lot of, I was gonna say D9, there's a lot of Divine Nine sorority and fraternity members that are a part of the Du Bois Circle, because there's this other group called the Boulay, which Du Bois was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha, and then later on, an honorary member of Alpha Phi Alpha, and then later on a member of Boulay, which is very influential Black men who are, there's a very active one here in Springfield. And two of our former chairs of the Board of Trustees for UMass are members of the Boulay in Springfield. However, women aren't invited to join the Boulay, only through their husbands. So you see the Du Bois Circle is like, okay, well, guess what we're gonna do? We are going to create an organization that does the work that Du Bois wants to do out in the community, and we're women, and that's who we are. And so they were pretty influential in progressive movements about women's rights, suffrage, and looking at the fact that there were suffragists that were in the Du Bois Circle and they're never named. And the Du Bois Circle is like not named. So it would be really great as they come on their 120th anniversary, or was it 1905? It's 1905. 1906. See, I'm sorry, I'm a recovering historian, excuse me. I don't do dates. 1906. Oh, you Googled it. Thank you. That's my right hand. So the idea that coming up, it is their 120th. And so getting into a partnership and them being very excited about being connected to the Du Bois Center is something that, for me, it brings in aspects of the ways in which Du Bois championed, in many ways, for the rights of women. So I am still talking about Du Bois and present topics. I don't want to minimize the importance of the Crisis magazine, not only publishing up and coming and like unknown poets and writers, but actually giving a platform for women to publish their work. Jessie Redmond Fawcett to create, and although it was short-lived, the Brownies book, which was for children, is the children's extension of the Crisis magazine. So there were all kinds of ways in which, and if you look at those Brownies books, they're amazing. They talk about different lands and different people and instruments, and they talk about culture, but they also talk about events happening basically in quote unquote Black America. And I think that, and Jesse Redmond Fawcett was also a writer in her own right, a writer in her own right. That doesn't, you understand what I'm saying, yes? She was an amazing writer. I think about Black Reconstruction, the amazing tome that Du Bois wrote in a moment where he could not get into many archives because of the color of his skin. Yet he was able to pull these resources, but it wasn't he alone, it was Irene Diggs. And Irene Diggs was a pioneering anthropologist who has yet to get the credit and the placement that she deserves in the canon of my own discipline, anthropology. So in that sense, at the Du Bois Circle, at the meeting, I was very fortunate because the head of the archives of Morgan State University is a part of the Du Bois Circle and said, yes, let's meet up when you are in Baltimore at the end of this month and to talk about Irene Diggs' papers, because we want Irene Diggs' information to get out there, as my archivist partner back there is nodding like this. So here's the thing. I talk a lot about the past, but there's no way that I could really convey to you how amazing it is to, when you study and you learn through Du Bois's work and you read his words, but you go beyond that and you begin to read correspondence. You begin to see parts of his personality come out. Not always good, because he's a human, you know, he gets upset at people. I remember one moment, and this is a really short story about some high school students coming to visit the archives from Baltimore. I'm sorry, the Berkshires. Baltimore's on my mind. And there was this one kind of collection, and our archivists are amazing at bringing things out to really engage different audiences, and they know how to do their stuff. And it was this receipt that was for the NAACP. They owed Du Bois, I think it was $3 or $4, and it said, "Here's a copy. Here's a copy of the receipt again. I'm going to need my money." And it was curt, but it was to the point. And it showed you Du Bois, you know, and one of the young women looked and was like, "Is he upset about not getting his money?" And I said, "Yes, that's what that is." And she was like, "That's his signature?" And it was this moment of like, it pulled her in because it was not curt, but it was polite, but she could, the attitude, it was dripping with innuendo of "pay me my money, NAACP." And so it's those kinds of moments that is why I'm so happy about, you know, excavating in the archives, because when I teach about the past and I use Du Bois as an example, I can also look to all of the people who Du Bois interacted with, and I can cover any topic, anything that's happening. I do want to, I am going to read this letter, the letter to the women. I'm looking at Adam for approval. I've said nothing controversial here today. Oh no, I might have. I said race, I said Black. Don't write a grant. So, like I said, Du Bois gave platforms, multiple platforms to women. And not only that, Du Bois was very sought after by women's groups and organizations to come and talk. And there's also something in the archives about a list of topics that he is available to cover. And there's half-topic talks, and I think they were like, it was like $7, or I can't remember what the fee was. But it was like a fee scale for talks. And then the full lecture was like this. And there's so many different letters of organizations asking specifically for Du Bois to come and speak to their organization. And he often, and some of the topics were managing your money as a woman, as a single woman. It was things like employment, seeking out opportunities for advancement in education and things like that. It wasn't about the domestic arts or domestic stuff. It was about being a single woman, managing your money. There was a lot of, it was dripping, I'm using that word a lot today. It was dripping with respectability politics, right? It was about respecting yourself. But it was also a reflection because it was, I would say it was early on in Du Bois's career, and it was very much a reflection of his own conservatism as he was a young man. Unlike some people, he seems to be much more radical as he gets older. Not as, so, okay. So I'm just gonna, how are we doing for time? I'm just gonna probably end with this letter and then open it up. I said I was having a conversation and I talked the whole time, okay. But this was written in July of 1959 by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it is titled Greetings to Women. Okay. I have been asked to greet you, and I do it gladly, for women have played a great role in my life. My mother, deprived of her husband by the pressure of her well-meaning but narrow-minded family, gave her whole life to me. We were companions, and even when she was lame from overwork and worry, we walked out happily arm in arm. She bore the burden of our poverty nobly and with a smile. And despite the dark warnings of friends, despite the dark warnings of her friends, held high her steadfast ideals for me, ignoring their fears that I would be spoiled by her faith and hope. That always struck me, that just one line, that I would be spoiled by her faith and hope. The wife of my youth made me a warm and spotless home, lived faithfully there while I wandered through the world trying to save it. She worshiped our beautiful sun, and when the uncurbed sewage of a Georgia city killed him in infancy, she too almost died, yet lived on to rear our daughter and granddaughter. For 53 years, we lived together until her death. Then came Shirley Graham, the wife of my age, the faithful companion and helpmate of my last years, sustaining and helping me in my last thoughts and efforts, until the time when my granddaughter gave me a great-grandson. Then together, Shirley and I searched across the world and found it good. There have been many other women. Dash, dash, dash. I'm not making that up. Dash, dash, dash. Friends and helpers in many times and places who worked with me and whom I loved for their belief and sacrifice. Why should I not greet them and bow humbly before all the women of the world? I feel like I want you to read between those lines or think between those lines, not just the dash. And so I'm hoping that I wanted to give a very different kind of vibe on Du Bois today, because I think that I don't want to put what would Du Bois do with this situation? What would Du Bois think about this situation? What I would love for us to think about is how does the past, how his Du Bois's interactions with the past and different events and the aspects of his work and his life work that touched the United States and the world in many, many different ways that I think changed it for the better. And how do we see that And how do we interpret it for ourselves to help us navigate this moment, especially in the United States? And I'm going to keep saying United States, United States. I just wish we like called ourselves United Statesians or something. Like in Spanish, Estados Unidos, like there's a name, like, because I don't know if you all saw, but Bad Bunny showed us that the Americas span from Canada all the way down to the tip of South America. So in that vein, between the dash of the women and Bad Bunny, I leave you and ask you if you have any questions. If you could find a place to find a question to ask, I'm open to it. Yes.
I'm going to be impolite and
Sure.
still ask you something about what Du Bois might say or might think or might write. Du Bois, looking at the scene here in the United States, where, as opposed to the time he did most of his work, it's become a country where there are many, many, many different groups, in addition to the white group of the United States. What advice would he give all of those groups, including the white group, as to how to manage this extraordinarily pluralistic society we have now?
That's interesting, because I feel that sometimes it's hard. Maybe it's also because I'm coming from the time period that I'm in, that to see things in black and white has always been problematic to me, because it's not black and white. It's like you're saying, there's many, many people, and there's many people from different areas, and that dual black and white doesn't necessarily hold for our country today. I think that, and I would refer to Black Reconstruction as probably the easiest way for me to attempt to answer or get close to an answer to that. And that is the first couple of chapters on Black labor and white labor. And for him, the question was, how does folks in Europe familiar with Marx as laborers coming to the United States at the moment where many people have just been freed from captivity, as in Black labor. And he was talking about, at that moment, during that Reconstruction moment, right, post 1865 to 1877, when he felt that the United States could have had a moment of real democracy and equality in terms of the labor, not the capitalists, but the labor becoming the means in which we govern ourselves. We find a way to have a direct access to the benefits of our labor, to not be beholden to the, like Marx would say, to the oligarchs and to the folks who are telling us that we have a false sense of connection with the products of our labor when we don't. So he saw that moment as something that could have shifted the United States away from capitalism into a place that could have been an equal space or an equal kind of nation. I think that moment having passed, and the turn of the century, and then I look at the ways in which Black wealth and white wealth are they're looked at as not being equal. There are gaps in employment, there are gaps in education, the criminal justice system, et cetera, et cetera. The perpetuation of that, to me, Du Bois is, and it's not limited, I think Du Bois would really emphasize the role of capitalism in the ways in which we interact with each other, the ways in which we support each other or don't support each other, and the idea of the waves of migrants or folks that come to this country and then diversify it even more, create different types of burdens, different types of ways in which it's not easy to create a society of equity when people's labor is often how they're defined, they're valued. And I don't know if it would be beyond the idea of capitalism as the means of how we've gotten to where we are right now, where we predict the health of the country based on the Dow Jones or based on the monthly numbers that come out of employment or unemployment. And I think that I don't think there's language for what you're asking in something that Du Bois has written. That's why it's hard to answer for me, because I see it directly tied to the limits and the restraints of capitalism, like in every way. Because without capitalism, racism wouldn't exist.
Really? Our friends from China wouldn't necessarily agree with you.
In this country, racism and let me restate that. In this country, racism and capitalism are hand in hand. I'm not saying that, okay, I exaggerated that, but capitalism, racism is going to exist, but racism is not human nature. I would argue that to the nth degree. Racism is not human nature. So I just think capitalism fuels it. That's a better way to say it. Yes, ma'am.
So I have a question.
Uh-huh.
If race is a social construct
Mm-hmm.
and not biological,
Mm-hmm.
why do we, highly educated and credentialed people in university, continue to create that construct? And why do we always make race other-oriented without including the fact that it is relational, and it is relational to whiteness as the construct?
Because
So when we talk about racism, we never say the invisible part, which is whiteness and white supremacy.
but I think we do.
No, we don't.
I think we do.
You didn't say white supremacy once today in your lecture.
I didn't need to,
Why?
because I think it's implied.
Why wouldn't you say the words?
White supremacy?
Yeah.
I'm standing in an institution that's founded on white supremacy.
Yes, it is. And when you say the words white supremacy,
But racism is a white problem. It's not a black problem.
within this institution, when you say the words white supremacy in a predominantly white area,
Mm-hmm.
you get dead.
Okay. I'm not concerned about that because of the words on that door right there, the W.E.B. Du Bois Center. I'm not worried about saying white supremacy. But that's also because if you look around the timeline on this wall and you look at Du Bois's work and you look at our archival collection, I'm not talking about faculty here. I'm talking about archivists, and I'm talking about the folks that come to do research here. There's no shying away from words like communism, terms like white supremacy, terms like, racism is not my problem. I didn't make it. But that's just, and my saying that is coming from a place of privilege as director of this center. Yes.
My name is Charles Vancouver, senior national man. My question is about the PBS documentary coming out. Is there any type of connection to the Du Bois Center? Have they consulted you? Is there any type of advertising coming mass in these papers? I know that's a big documentary coming out in May. So I was just
No, Charles, you know we got something to do with that. Yes, so there's a PBS documentary coming out about Du Bois, and when I tell you the late night hours and phone calls of trying to get the permissions of the images our newly incoming dean had to deal with as soon as he arrived here, that was one of the first things that happened that we had. Yes, so, and we've discussed, I do have to say this summer, our lecturer, our annual lecturer from 25, Karita Brown, she is apparently the American Sociological Association is having a panel with, I believe, Karita, I guess now it's me, I'm not a sociologist, but Ruth, one of the producers of the film, and Viola Davis. I'm like, ooh, she asked me if I wanted. I was like, what? What? Yes. So they're gonna do that, but rest assured, we're gonna have a screening here, definitely. We just haven't nailed it down. But yes, because because the way we got to know that and working with, I never understood like the details of representation of archival material that you have to get permission to show a picture of something that is 100 years, well not, but very old, but we did. And we have the papers, but not the rights. Complicated. So, yeah, that's a project that maybe, don't look at me like that. Yes, that's true. The archivist looks at me with chagrin. Yes. Yes, girl.
Okay, I know we're over time, but my question was about where would you turn someone who's interested in Du Bois' relationship with starting women's organizations or like setting the foundation for that? Because that's not the first time I've heard of it, but it's something that's kind of buried in his achievements, and I'm interested in that.
I think that in some ways, a lot of his work with women's organizations are overshadowed by, dare I say, the mythology. So there, if I look at like Du Bois and his, I guess as my teens would say, his ops, like people, his opposition, like his, not enemies, that's why I don't want to call them enemies, but folks that he had some disagreements with. Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey. The Marcus Garvey stuff was really ugly. I don't even understand why it was so personal. Maybe one day we'll understand. I don't know what that was. But also with Ida B. Wells. And I believe that Ida B. Wells, the mythology of it, sometimes overshadows the work that he did do with women's organizations and them seeking him out. And also, because please understand, and I've had this discussion with Paula Giddings, Ida B. Wells' biographer, one of her biographers, and she joked and said, yeah, y'all too obsessed with Du Bois up there at UMass, but it's fine. However, she told me the story, or a story, about Ida B. Wells inviting Du Bois to come out to talk about his new book, right? Soul to Black Folk. He's like, no, I can't do that. And Ida was like, fine, whatever. Understand that Ida B. Wells was in the game a long time before here's this young Willie Du Bois is riding up on the scene. So I think that sometimes the timeline gets a little skewed and people are thinking Ida B. Wells and W.B. Du Bois were not equals. She was really out there creating this anti-lynching campaign, and she was an investigative journalist before we had a term for that. So his work with women's groups was about financial stability, financial independence, the working world, being, different kinds of occupations. But at the same time, when I alluded to the fact that I think he was very conservative, by him saying that, he also discussed birth control, not having too many children unless you could afford it. I mean, dare I say, he had some thoughts along those lines. And so it was a mixed, as it got old, and I'm going to be honest, the archives again, some of his letters to his wife and his daughter, it's interesting, women that aren't his wife and daughter he's very hard on his daughter. He's very, very hard on her. And imagine the pressure that puts on you. Not only all this money and all this big thing for this big wedding, right? To County Cullen, this is the marriage of the century. It's the Black American wedding of yes, it's the only thing that anyone is talking about in Harlem and beyond. It didn't work out for reasons. It was a lavender marriage, but it didn't quite work out, if you get what I mean. But apparently Du Bois didn't know. I don't know how, but it's to think about his personal life and how he interacted with the women in his life versus how he was a champion for those folks to publish and do this and do that, is always reminds me that W.E.B. Du Bois is a human being with complicated ways about him. So, but yeah, the stuff with, and that interaction with women's groups, organization lasts a long time. It lasts throughout his life. As you see in this letter, the dash. Okay, so I think we can wrap up. Yeah? Okay? Thank you.